Hello everyone! Today I'm going to show you how to hem a suit sleeve. So this technique can vary depending on what the brand of suit is or if it's a male or female suit, but in general the process is going to be the same for any suit jacket or coat of this kind. First, you are going to begin by removing all of the sleeve buttons, and this would be the time that you would also unpick any buttonholes from the sleeve as well. This coat does not have them, and this is a good time to note that if the coat has working buttonholes, you will not be able to use this technique to hem the sleeve. So I am going to measure the mark that I made where the sleeve needs to be hemmed. And I'm going to go ahead and mark that distance all the way around the sleeve. This is going to be my new hemline. And now we're going to start unpicking. You'll notice that I use a razor blade. It is my preferred method of seam ripping. And I'm just going to start by opening up the faux flap here. And you don't want to unpick the actual seam that is holding the sleeve together. We just want to unpick these stitches that are holding this flap closed, and a lot of those stitches will be the stitches from the buttons that we're going to pull out as well. Now we are not going to unpick the seam that attaches the lining to the sleeve quite yet. And the next thing we're going to do is unpick the seams at the corners of these flap openings. You will need to open the lining just a tad, just enough so you have access to these corner edges. And we're going to unpick the stitches that are making these folds. Now for the first outer fold, I'm going to open this up, and this example is a little tricky because I can see that someone else has hemmed this sleeve previously, and to be honest, the stitches are not the best, and I can tell that they didn't quite know what they were doing, but that's okay. I'm going to make a mark on the inside of the sleeve where that fold is. I'm just copying my mark from the other side. And now I'm going to do a series of markings. I want to make a mark where the new hemline is going to be, which is that horizontal line. You can see that that's the mark I already marked. And then the vertical line is right in the crease of where that vent folds back. So I have a cross down the crease and a horizontal line across the new hemline. And then I'm going to make two diagonal markings going across this cross mark that I've made. So I have a bit of an asterisk shape here, and this is going to help guide us as we stitch down this corner, so we have a nice mitered corner on this sleeve vent. As you can see, I'm folding along the diagonal line that points up into the sleeve, and where I'm going to stitch is along the other diagonal line. So the fold should be right at the cross point of my asterisk, and this fold should bring the raw edges of the bottom of the sleeve and the sleeve vent opening to the same side, which is what you see on the top there. And we want this to be a really crisp corner, so that fold is right at the asterisk point, and we're going to stitch along this straight line, which is actually one of our diagonal lines. and we're going to stitch all the way from the raw edge of the fabric to the fold. Okay, now we're going to let that side simmer for a minute, and we're going to do the inside flap of the sleeve opening. We're going to go ahead and open up the stitching that is holding that fold together. This side is significantly easier. We want to just mark where that hemline is going to go. And this is going to be just a straight stitch down the new fold. So we're going to fold up where that new hemline is going to be, and I'm going to stitch just right in the ditch of where the old fold was, and I'm going to go as high as I can until that flap opening starts. So just right down that ditch where the old stitching was, about a 1/4 inch away from the edge. Okay, now this looks like a bit of a hot mess right now, but no worries. We are going to now push these folds. There's my stitching of the straight inside flap, so I'm going to push that corner out to the right side. And on the other side, it's a little bit tricky with the mitered corner since we don't have quite as much seam allowance as we would have from the original mitered corner. I like to fold this raw edge in just a touch when I'm stitching, just so that when I poke this corner out, that raw edge wants to go in. Now, once we attach the lining, this isn't really, you're not going to see it, it's not going to be an issue. So don't worry about this raw edge poking out. But if you can, I like to fold it under slightly and give it a little press, just so none of those little threads are poking out. Just fold it under just maybe 1/8 of an inch when you go and give all of this a press. Which our next step is to give all of this a press, but we want to make sure that when this flap is laying flat, that the outer flap and the inner flap are the same length, which it's looking pretty good here. So we're gonna go ahead and press this corner. So here she is all pressed. Now I just pressed the corner. I don't want to mess with pressing the other part of the hem yet, but I wanted to make sure my miter was nice and crisp. I folded under those raw edges as best as I could, and the flap is laying nicely closed. Now we are going to go into the inside of the jacket. So in the seam of the lining here, you will usually find some top stitching that was stitched from the outside of the garment that you can visually see, that you will be able to open up. If your jacket does not have this visible top stitching in the lining, that is okay. You can still go ahead and open up about a 7-inch opening in the seam of the lining so that we can access the inside of the sleeve. Be generous. We want plenty of room to be able to work with here. So now I'm pulling out this sleeve hem out through the hole that I've made in the lining, and you will probably find that there are several tack points that are tacking the lining to the outside of the jacket to make sure that the lining doesn't get twisted inside the jacket. So you want to go ahead and find all of those anchor points and unpick them, and then you're also going to want to unpick any stitching that is holding this fold in place. There will be several anchor points around the outside of the hem that are holding this sleeve fold in place. Now we're not unstitching the stitches that are actually connecting the lining to the sleeve, and we're not touching anything that we did with the mitered corners of the vent opening. Here's another anchor that I'm unstitching. I just want to be able to have complete movement around this sleeve hem. And so now I'm gonna try to fiddle and get this, make sure that the flap vent opening is laying nicely. And as I'm fiddling with this, I'm noticing that I unpicked a little too high on the vent opening. So I am going to fold those out and just stitch, follow the side seam stitching of the sleeve down until I am past where the extra allowance for that vent opening goes. This is important because, as you can see, there is a lot of extra fabric down by this vent opening, more so than just the regular seam allowance, and we don't want that vent opening to be open more than where that extra seam allowance is. Okay, so I added that stitching. You can kind of see it here very lightly. And now we are back to the fidgety part. The first thing I'm going to try to do is to make sure that these flaps of the vent are laying correctly, with the one in back that's supposed to be in back and the one on the outside on the outside. And the mitered one goes on the outside, in case you've forgotten. And now I'm just going to make sure that the suit jacket outer fabric is all laying nice and flat with the lining fabric on the inside. Now we have not unstitched the seam that connects the lining to the jacket, so we should be in pretty good shape, but we just want to make sure there's no weird ripples. In this case, you can see that there is some weird tack marks from where somebody had possibly hemmed it before, but I'm pretty sure that we are hemming this sleeve higher than those weird tack marks. We're taking more off than where that is, so I am just going to leave them for the time being, and I think it will all work out for the best. But as you can see, it's hand stitching. You never know what you're gonna find inside a suit jacket or inside any garment, but I find in particular men's suits will often have very interesting things inside them. You can see the cuff is also a little dirty there. So I'm going to pull out the outside of the sleeve real quick just to double check that measurement that we are going to be hemming. It's always a good idea to double check, especially when it's been several steps from when we first marked it to this step now. So I am going to measure on the inside of the lining up from the stitch line that is originally connecting the lining to the outer garment, and I'm going to mark that on the lining side. You could also do this from the jacket side as well. I personally find it easier to work on the lining side. So I am measuring up from the stitching that is connecting the lining to the outer sleeve. Don't worry about where the fold is, where the hem fold is. I promise it'll all work out in the end, but we are going to measure up from that stitch line that's connecting the lining to the outside of the hem. And when we start stitching, you are going to start and end at your vent because we can't stitch through the vent. So we're going to start stitching as close as you can get at that vent opening, and we are stitching through the lining and the outer fabric of the jacket only. You don't want to stitch through any extra folds or anything. You might end up stitching your sleeve closed. You can see my markings there, and I want to keep this as smooth as possible and stitch along that mark through the lining and through the sleeve. And I'm going to slowly turn the sleeve as I go. Make sure that this all stays straight. You're going to want to make sure that your other sleeve seams match up right here, as you can see, of the lining and of the outer jacket. Use pins if you feel like it will help you. But you're just going to shimmy this section of sleeve up into the sewing machine. Start at the vent and stitch all the way around to the other vent. You won't be able to make the ends of this stitch line meet each other. You won't be able to sew completely in a circle. Here you can see my finished stitch line. My side seam there meets, and you can see here where it shows through on the other side. I'm sorry, I don't have a video of me actually stitching this, but I just want to show you how this is all connecting. There's my side seam that meets. There's the lining side seam. Over here where the vent is, you can see that my stitch lines do not meet up. Okay, now I am going to pull this sleeve back to the right side through that opening, and I'm going to just make sure that everything looks good. I'm going to pull the outer sleeve and make sure to place the fold in the correct spot. Some of the rubbings have marked off, but that's okay. I can still kind of see. Sometimes when you're moving around, your chalk marks might get a little lost, but I can still kind of see them. So what I'm going to do is push this lining up into the inside of the coat. I'm going to fold this where I originally marked it. And we're just making sure everything looks nice and clean, like a real suit jacket hem. You can see slightly where that opening is, where the vent goes. The lining's all connected really nicely. It's not seeming like it wants to pop out and be visible on the outside of the sleeve. Everything looks very nice. It's always so interesting to me how moving that stitch line that connects the lining to the outside of the jacket up the same amount that we need to hem off of the sleeve makes everything fall into place so nicely whenever you turn it right sides out. So now we are going to give this a little press. So our jacket is nice and pressed, and now we need to get back into that sleeve again because we want to redo all of the tacks and anchor points that are going to hold this sleeve fold in place, because we don't want this nice hem to fall from everyday wear. So I'm going to grab this fold in between my thumb and my fingers and push that sleeve seam allowance up out through our opening that we left, and I'm holding that fold inside that lining pretty snug. And I'm going to take some There you can see I'm holding on to that fold. You want to make sure that you're not shifting this fold. Hold it into place as you're doing these tacks. And I'm going to take my hand needle and I am going to very loosely, starting at the side seam, I am tacking side seam allowance to side seam allowance, the outer and the inner. And I am just going to shift this over. I'm still holding the fold. And now that I'm stitching where there is no seam allowance to catch, I am just barely catching a couple threads of that outer jacket and stitching into the lining. And I'm leaving this pretty loose. You don't want to pull your thread too tightly. You're just sort of doing a tack every inch or so. Again, I'm picking up just a couple threads on the outside of that jacket and pushing the needle in through the lining, pulling and leaving a loose tension. We want the jacket to still be able to have movement. We don't want anything to look like it's caught from the outside. We're just tacking this fold so it doesn't want to fall down as you're wearing it. So you can see there how loosely I'm leaving the thread in between each little tack. Just pick up a couple threads, push it through the lining, and turn as you go. And once you get over to your vent area, this is a good place to, we have some seam allowance to work with, so we want to do a more sturdy anchor here. So I'm going to go through it a couple times, going through the seam allowance, not through the actual outside of the jacket, connecting it to the lining, and I'm gonna do a couple loops as well as go ahead and do a knot here. And this is usually a good point to fish your needle through the loop and sort of twist your sleeve around so that you can get through the other half of the sleeve. I'm going to stick my hand back up in there, make sure I'm holding on to that fold, and I'm going to continue tacking the rest of this sleeve in place. Of course, we're going to add a knot at the end. And now our sleeve hem is all tacked in place. The fold is not going anywhere, but we do want to put some of those anchor points in place that are going to keep the sleeve from twisting. So you're going to pull it completely right side out, and through this hole, we're going to just find spots where the lining seam allowance, the seam allowance of the lining and the seam allowance of the outer edge match. And I'm just gonna put a couple back and forth back stitches there on my machine, and I'm going to turn this around to our other sleeve seam, and we're going to do the same thing. You want to make sure that the sleeve lining is laying flat when you figure out where you're going to put these tacks. So I'm just going to reach my hand in while everything is laying flat, grab a hold of both seam allowances, the seam allowance of the lining and of the jacket, and I'm going to go to the machine and just put a couple stitches in place there that will keep the lining from getting twisted as the jacket gets put on and off. And lastly, I am going to stitch top stitch this lining closed, the same place that we unpicked at the beginning. Okay, here's a finished view. We have my top stitching here that's closing our access hole. I'm going to pull this out to be right sides out. Make sure that's laying flat. It looks really nice. And the last thing we have to do is stitch our buttons back on. Okay, so you can measure this based on what it was on the original jacket. My rule of thumb is that the first button goes about 1.5 inches up from the hem, and then we're gonna measure in 1/2 inch from that side seam. Do a better job of marking than I do in this video. And then generally each button is going to be about 1/2 inch apart. So I have 4 buttons, so I'm going to make 3 more marks going up the jacket 1/2 inch. Now you will notice that our vent obviously doesn't go all the way up the same as the original. That is fine. Usually when you hem a jacket, you're going to get a much shorter opening on your vent. It's a faux vent anyways, it's just there for looks. We can't open it anymore with the limited seam allowance we have up in the jacket. So, but the opening at the bottom still gives that 3-dimensional effect as if the vent went all the way up. So when I stitch on this first button, I want to kind of make sure to catch any extra layer of this vent opening, any seam allowance. I want to kind of close up and hold closed the bottom bit of this vent with this first button that I'm stitching on. Because remember, we couldn't fully connect that sleeve lining stitching. So I want to sort of close that up with this first button that I'm attaching. And I typically make sure that my thread is long enough so I can do all of the buttons in one go. And I just sew from button to button and then stick my needle in through the inside of the jacket up to the next button, as so. Make sure that you're not stitching through the lining here. You don't want these stitches to show on the lining side. And just continue attaching all the buttons in this manner. Okay, and the very last thing I want to do is just to check where this vent opening is separated with the lining. If the gap is small enough, if you were able to shimmy up in there enough whenever you did your original stitching, you may not need to add any tacking. But sometimes I like to go in and tack these 2 vent pieces together and also just tack the lining in place right here just to make sure that that hole doesn't expose any threads or seam allowance or anything like that, just so it's tacked and looks really nice from the inside. And there you have it. We are done with our sleeve hem. These buttons want to wiggle everywhere on me. Now, obviously, we want to get rid of these markings, so I'm just going to give it a light press to finish off the jacket, get rid of those markings, and make sure everything looks really nice. And now you just repeat all of that on the other sleeve. Thank you so much for joining me for this tutorial today. It was a bit of a doozy. I hope you find it helpful. If you have any questions, be sure to let me know in the comments below. And check out the tutorials section of my YouTube channel for more tutorials like this one. And do let me know what other types of tutorials you would like to see. Happy sewing, everyone. Bye.